Welcome everybody to Caltech, to our conference on Rich Rocks, the climate crisis, and the tech Imperium. I'm Jed Buchwald, professor of history at Caltech and director of the Caltech Huntington Research Institute in the history of science and technology. We are very lucky to have had with us this year Sofia Kalantzakos, Global Distinguished Professor in Environmental Studies and Public Policy at NYU and NYU Abu Dhabi. Of course, these first 2 years of this new research institute have been difficult because of the pandemic, but nevertheless, we have been able to move ahead. And Sofia has been with us throughout the entire year under these difficult circumstances and has organized this marvelous conference. So today, we will be hearing from a group of distinguished people that Sofia has put together, and she will run the conference and introduce all of the speakers. If you have any questions, please use the Q&A facility to send them in, and they will be addressed following the last presentation. And with that, I turn it over to Sofia.
Thank you so much, Jed. I'd like to welcome everybody to session 3 of Rich Rocks, the Climate Crisis and the Tech Imperium. Today's panel builds on yesterday's, and our roster of speakers features some fabulous additions. I would really like to thank everybody for being here. First, Jonas Nam, Assistant Professor of Energy Resources and Environment at Johns Hopkins, will be discussing collaborative advantage, forging green industries in the new global economy. Then we'll hear from Dr. Roland Gauss, Senior Advisor, Substitution and Recycling, Sustainable Materials for Future Mobility, EIT Raw Materials, who will update us on materials criticality in light of Europe's Green Deal. I hear he has some really great news to share with us today as well. We've spoken a good deal about how Sino-US hyper-competition is impacting the global decarbonization and digitalization transition. But Europe offers a perspective of getting the job done without squarely buying into the narrative of this kind of bipolar competition with China. Next, we will hear from Ben Sampson, principal at 40 North Ventures, who will discuss the role of risk capital and innovation in the race against climate change. Decarbonization and digitalization cannot happen without investment, both private and public. Yesterday, we spoke extensively about global supply chains and how they have become a major source of contention in the debate between decoupling and interdependence. Rick Sains, a partner at Pollination, will be talking about the supply chain transparency, accountability, and governance trends, the expanding frontier. Finally, Johan Nylander, Regional Technical Advisor for Carbon Pricing at ASEAN, consultant and UNFCCC Collaborative Instruments for Ambitious Climate Action, will be discussing decarbonization of industrial processes, carbon pricing, and industry response. Carbon pricing has faced much opposition, but inevitably, it plays a huge part in the global transition. Thank you all so much for being here. I would remind everyone to keep their presentation to 15 minutes so that we can have ample time for Q&A. And I would also like everybody to really submit questions so we have a rich and robust discussion. Thank you. And I pass it on to Jonas.
So I'm excited to be here and talk about this topic that is very dear to my heart. And I don't study rich rocks. I study clean energy industries more from the perspective of wind and solar. And so I think I'm going to present some maybe comparative lessons about what we can learn from the history of these industries for the challenges we're currently facing in batteries, EVs, lithium ion, and so on. And so to start, let me talk briefly about this book that I've been writing on for the past decade or so, really in a hot phase during COVID last summer. And it's a book really about the role of globalization in making clean energy industries competitive, affordable, and bringing new technologies to market quickly as a result of global supply chains. And it's a book really about China's role in making that possible. And so as I was working on this over the last, finishing it over the last year or so, the book's coming out in August, the world around us began to change. I think there was a lot of pushback against globalization before the pandemic, but the pandemic sort of accelerated these trends. And so the world that I'm describing in this book in many ways is no longer there. I think the sort of decoupling agenda has risen, certainly to the forefront in Washington, where I live, but I think it's being pushed elsewhere. And so what I thought I could do with my 15 minutes is talk about why I think meeting global climate goals requires collaboration with China, and offer 3 lessons that we can learn from the case of wind and solar for these broader debates. And so just to start, I think, it's clear why China is a big player in this field. It, still makes 2/3 of the world's solar panels, despite a lot of trade barriers that have been erected against Chinese panels. Wind turbine manufacturers make about 35% of global supply, mostly for the domestic market, but export a far higher share of components. China is the largest supplier of and market for electric vehicles, and it makes something like 70% of the world's lithium-ion batteries, which we need for all sorts of things in the clean energy transition. And so China is sort of the elephant in the room, and it's hard to get around. And yet, there is increasing pushback against China's role in these industries, and sort of an argument that we need to decouple and do our own thing. And so let me talk about sort of 3 facts that I think we should keep in mind as we debate how to deal with China in these spaces. And I want to start by talking about China's unique skills in manufacturing in these industries, then talk about China's role in sort of broader collaboration in these sectors and bringing these energy technologies to market fairly cheaply, and then talk about the benefits of collaboration, how we can maybe minimize the risks. And so the first fact that I want to talk about is this sort of role that China has played in manufacturing, particularly in wind and solar, that is pretty unique. I talk about this in my book extensively, and I call it innovative manufacturing. And so essentially, Chinese firms have not tried to really replicate what firms elsewhere in the world have been doing, but they've instead, in wind and solar at least, developed these unique skills at the intersection of engineering and manufacturing, engineering capabilities that really allow firms to simultaneously manage tempo, volume, and cost in bringing new energy technologies to market. And so when you go to Chinese clean energy manufacturing firms, you see designated R&D teams that in many ways look like R&D teams elsewhere in the world, but they're not necessarily focused on bringing new technologies sort of into the world, but rather taking existing technologies and making them cheaper, easier to manufacture, and easier to scale in manufacturing. And so this particular role that China has played in these global supply chains for wind and solar, where it's often taken technologies that were developed elsewhere in the world and licensed or developed in collaboration with partners and then brought them to market, this role really stems from 2 particular pathologies of decentralization in China. And I'm not going to go into that in detail. I'm sort of, the academic on this panel, and I could talk about this for hours. But there's been sort of a policy implementation gap in China, where the central government has really pushed innovation and sort of the development of new technologies, but subnational governments have been cash-strapped, are highly dependent on local GDP. And so they've really focused on short-term manufacturing initiatives and have really supported clean energy industries in manufacturing, not so much in innovation, because short-term results are coming from manufacturing, not from investments in new technologies that may or may not succeed. That has created an incredible infrastructure for financing for these new manufacturing facilities. Chinese banks have lent something like $47 billion US dollars to solar manufacturers alone. And that's really unmatched elsewhere in the world. There have been problems with the system. There's been excessive investment, overcapacity. There's also been a lot of protectionism within the Chinese system. But what we've gotten as a result is this incredible buildup of manufacturing infrastructure and the ability of these firms to build designated research facilities for manufacturing in the space. And so you see in the solar sector, even after the financial crisis, firms were able to borrow more and more money and invest in additional investment, which has helped us bring down costs, even if some firms like Suntech ended up failing in the system. And we now see, I think, a similar dynamic, a similar focus on manufacturing, for instance, in lithium-ion production, where China, lithium-ion battery production, where China is also investing aggressively. And so far, no other economy has really been willing to do something similar and to invest in this kind of scale. The second fact is that China hasn't done it alone. Clean energy technologies have come to market as the result of collaboration with firms from all over the world. If you look at the timing of Chinese wind and solar firms. They really brought wind turbine and solar PV manufacturing to scale that had not been done anywhere else in the world. And so they picked a unique niche because no one else had done it. Both of these industries were really cottage industries when Chinese firms entered. And so if you talk to people about this, they say, yeah, of course we focused on manufacturing. We could license technology, we could buy technology. What we couldn't do is learn from others how to manufacture these things at scale because no one had done it before us. And so what we got in wind and solar industries, and what is now under threat in these decoupling debates, is really division of labor between firms from all over the world. German equipment manufacturers that exported manufacturing equipment to China, Chinese manufacturers that used that manufacturing equipment, and often American component and material suppliers that worked with both of those partners to bring new technologies to market. And so it's been really a global system that has been built here, and one that is now threatened by these decoupling debates. And so these cost declines that we've been seeing over the last couple of years that now make wind and solar cost competitive in many parts of the world with conventional sources of energy, those cost declines are largely attributable to Chinese firms that have brought all of those partners together and invested in scale in manufacturing. While we talk about decoupling, I would say it's very unlikely that any other economy in the short run will be able to replicate China's manufacturing infrastructure. And that's problematic for climate change. If this was any other industry, we could talk about this in a different way. But since we don't have much time left to really reverse our emissions path, trying to replicate China's infrastructure is going to take time and it's going to delay us if we really push for hard decoupling from China. The third fact then is one that the benefits of collaboration really outweigh, I think, the risks of decoupling. There are, of course, risks and challenges in engaging China on this. China in clean energy has not been a level playing field. It has systematically denied access to domestic markets. Washington has legitimate concerns about forced technology transfers, which exist in many industries, maybe not so much in clean energy. There have been some improvements also in the removal of joint venture requirements and the strengthening of domestic IP institutions. But China has a long way to go. And so far, Chinese firms have a kind of home field advantage, and foreign firms are discriminated against in many sectors. There's another risk also of potential for lock-in. And I think we are seeing this both in the solar industry, but maybe also in batteries now, where China's ability to reduce the cost for existing technologies can prevent new technologies from being commercialized, because the existing technologies are now so cheap that the barrier for entry for new technologies is becoming quite high. And so we've seen that particularly in the US, much to the consternation of Washington, that US startups funded with federal research money are bringing new technologies out into the market, but then can't succeed commercially because existing, traditional crystalline solar technologies, for instance, are dominating the field because they're so cheap. And so that's also, of course, a risk, and one that we need to think about carefully. But as I said before, I think the benefit really from working with China on this is this carbon curve. I mean, the longer we wait to reverse our emissions trend, the sharper we have to reverse it in order to still meet the goal of limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. And so if we turn away from China now, that is such a dominant player in these global supply chains, not just because of its manufacturing capacity, but also because of the technical capabilities that come with that, it's going to be difficult for us to meet these goals because we can't replace China very quickly and very easily. And so there are 5 of us here, so let me sort of wrap up and think about some of the takeaways here. I've argued that what we should be doing is focusing on something, I'm sort of calling whimsically conscious collaboration with China. I think, decoupling is a very aggressive move, one with very negative consequences for climate. And there's something we can do differently in how we engage China without decoupling altogether. I think in the short run, it's very clear that there are very few alternatives to working with China on the commercialization and deployment of clean energy technologies to meet our medium-term climate goals. I think that's true in wind and solar. I think that's also true in vehicle electrification, where Chinese batteries and Chinese EV manufacturers are going to have to play a big role. But it's not a zero-sum game. And I think particularly in Washington, that's how it's been discussed. There are many opportunities for intervention to increase, for instance, the benefits for US startups in working with Chinese manufacturers. But there are also long-term opportunities for American policymakers to support, finally, the competitiveness of the domestic manufacturing industry. We have sat in Washington for many years and blamed China for everything that's going well in China and is not going well here, but we have not really invested in a full industrial policy toolkit to support manufacturing here. There are no comparable financing institutions, for instance, that would lend the kind of money required to scale up a manufacturing industry like the one in China. We have much smaller venture capital, businesses that need shorter term returns and can fund this kind of scale. So maybe a federal infrastructure bank for manufacturing would be a good start. I also think that collaboration is going to be important if we try to scale up manufacturing domestically, because that's where a lot of the knowledge about manufacturing exists today. And so even as we try to develop in the US sort of alternative to Chinese supply chains, we're going to have to learn from China in doing that. I think Europe, and I think Roland is going to talk about that in more detail, Europe is probably on a more productive path in this direction, both working with China very closely, but also building up a domestic alternative. And so the battery consortium in Europe is one example that we could learn from, but we haven't really seen a similar concerted effort to do that in the United States. And I think in part that is because DC has historically such a averse relationship with the word industrial policy in the first place. And so let's work with China in the short term to try to fix the climate problem. That doesn't preclude us from also building up alternatives to Chinese supply chains and Chinese producers in these sectors to create more economic benefits for us at home as we invest in these technologies. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Roland. Thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you very much, Jonas. And I will share my screen. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm grateful to be invited to this conference, and for sure, this topic is timely. The EU and its member states aim to become climate neutral by 2050. A successful transition fundamentally depends on Europe's ability to develop and deploy clean energy and mobility solution in an economically and environmentally sustainable way. In addition, industrial and home appliances will need to run under the highest energy efficiency standards. This ambition has been addressed by the European Green Deal, and raw materials and advanced materials are the key enablers for this transition. That is, from a brown to a green economy, from fossil fuels to functional materials in new energy applications. Now, leading this transition means that you have to lead also the transition towards responsible sourcing of raw materials and advanced materials. And you have to be a leader in the transition to a true circular economy. And I see 4 key challenges for the EU here. And this includes a lack of diversified and transparent sustainable supply chains for clean tech. And related to that, a lack of awareness across key decision makers in society as a whole on the really bigger importance of the subject matter. Introducing renewable energy has comes with increasing energy costs. And for now, this has really been a challenge for the profitability of businesses. EU is comparatively slow in translating smart ideas into innovation and then jobs and growth. And the EU massively lags behind digital technology industry. So with this presentation, I would like to give you a view on how Europe has begun to respond to these challenges. I will focus on the tool of industrial alliances. Having said that, I would like to emphasize that I do not represent the European Commission. I work for EIT Raw Materials, which is a so-called innovation community, which is co-funded by the European Commission. So EIT Raw Materials is a pan-European innovation community. We claim to be the world's largest innovation community in raw materials, that is in various specific raw materials value chains. We have more than 120 core and associated partners and more than 180 project partners from industry, research, and universities. And we very much believe in this knowledge triangle to push innovation. We are represented in 22 countries in Europe with 6 innovation hubs and so-called 8 innovation centers and a headquarter in Berlin. And we have an annual budget of 80 to 100 million euros that we put into technology development projects, technology upscaling projects, educational projects, startups, and matchmaking events and tools. Now, in its 2021 update of the EU industrial strategy, the EU has identified both securing a greater strategic autonomy and developing more resilient supply chains for Europe's industrial ecosystem as a key cornerstone. So here you see on the right-hand side, the EU industrial ecosystems as defined by the Commission. And for 3 examples, how they link to key materials and technologies. So in this context, in this backdrop, a variety of actions also related to critical materials have been announced. On a more top level, the strategy includes, for example, to develop sustainable financing criteria for the mining, extractive and processing sectors in a delegated acts on taxonomy, to map the potential supply of secondary critical raw materials from EU stocks and wastes, to identify mining and processing projects and investment needs and related financing opportunities for critical raw materials in the EU that can be operational by 2025. And here there's a particular priority to coal mining regions to facilitate a just transition in these geographic areas, and the creation of a dedicated industrial alliance on raw materials, the European Raw Materials Alliance. So these industrial alliances are a new tool. So far, the Commission has launched a Circular Plastic Alliance, a European Battery Alliance, a European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, and IRMA, the European Raw Materials Alliance. And these alliances all have in common that they aim to identify regulatory bottlenecks that hinder innovation breakthrough. And this identification process is linked to a stakeholder consultation process involving industrial players from across specific value chain. So you have this cross value chain perspective, as well as representatives from academia and wider society, including NGOs. And together they can then identify key challenges and solutions and provide kind of an action plan to the Commission that is deeply grounded in real life experience and challenges. And at the same time, these industrial alliances are also fertile grounds for matchmaking and promoting specific investment cases that would, if implemented, fundamentally change business. Now here you see the structure of this European Battery Alliance that was launched in 2017 with this stakeholder consultation process that delivered an action plan, which was then translated into a strategic plan for batteries by the Commission. You can really see, and that it really covers the full value chain from raw materials extraction, cell manufacturing, battery materials manufacturing, and then all the way to electric vehicles and recycling. So you have this policy component, and then you have specific funding tools that were developed. And the most important one is called Important Projects of Common European Interest. It's a tool to really push innovation close to industry. It's really bending competition law. It's like getting really close to competition law rules, but of course, carefully assessed by the Commission to really fulfill still WTO criteria. But it's really promoting innovation towards industry deployment, industrial employment. And this has been considered a super success case. And the backdrop is, of course, that Europe as kind of an automotive region and with its member states active in automotive industry and energy transition, we want to have that, but at the same time, we totally lack and fall behind when it comes to the battery value chain in all steps, all the way from raw materials. You see the EU component to processed materials to cells. So this is the picture in 2017, facing this hockey stick development. In gray, the uptake of battery technology altogether, and then the description of the individual battery technologies. Now, a few years later, you see various investments taking place, various projects that come in Europe. So these bar charts is really showing the investment cases. and the cumulative capacity, battery capacity they would provide. And here you see the forecast in terms of demand. And so you have this industrial development and the same, and making available this important component. At the same time, you create a lot of jobs. And we did a report, a study that there are 90 direct jobs per gigawatt hour and 300 indirect jobs all across the value chain. Now, this transition, this energy transition is of course not only linked to the availability of batteries and battery cells. There are other vital value chains linked to all kinds of clean tech. And this is a table that I took from the International Energy Agency showing the high concentration in the production of these metals, all the way from copper, nickel, cobalt, to rare earths and lithium. And you have even a higher concentration in production when you look at the processing stages. And so it's really not only is it a challenge and a narrative related to the extraction and mining, it's also a challenge that we need to develop, or risk mitigation measures really need to consider the full value chain and the capacity of a country to implement a capacity for circular economy and recycling. So for this and this background, the European Raw Materials Alliance was launched in 2020 under the leadership of Commissioner Breton and Vice President Šefčovič. EIT Raw Materials was given the coordination. The launch was supported by 62 MEPs under the leadership of Anna Michelle Asimarkopoulou. We now have more than 500 partners in IRMA and have already identified 40 investment projects with a total investment volume of 9.4 billion euros. And we're seeking now various funding opportunities. So we really believe that this is a game changer in translating innovation really in raw materials to commercialization. Now, as indicated before, we have these two work streams here again, identify regulatory bottlenecks and this investment platform. And we are organized up until now in two clusters, one on rare earth magnets and motors, and the second one on material storage, materials for energy storage and conversion. Yeah, this is just, of course, you know, this high concentration of production when it comes to the rare earth supply chain. So Europe, if we want to stay, stay a leader in manufacturing these clean technologies, wind turbines were mentioned before, we need to have some sort of control of the supply chain. Today, 98% of these rare earth permanent magnets are imported from China to Europe. There's a second, second key aspect. Why should we invest into rare earth materials and innovation? In the past, you can demonstrate quite nicely that R&D and engineering in these fields have always delivered some major innovation breakthroughs. So there's this link to the gas lamp, the color television, catalysts, aerospace, specialty glasses. Today, they play a major role. The lead market really is permanent magnets in these clean technologies, but also manufacturing, robots, domestic appliances. And in the future, they can play a major role in facilitating new energy efficient cooling technologies, in optoelectronics, and hydrogen technologies. And here you see how much the Commission has invested in terms of R&D over the last 10 years, almost 400 million euros. And you see the spike following the rare earth crisis. And it's really time to make use of that funding, of these projects, and really deploy industrial innovation. And when we say we do a stakeholder consultation process, we really bring people together to really understand challenges upstream and downstream. Upstream, it's really the lack of investment in Europe, price volatility, the social license to operate issue, limited R&D capacity, in comparison to Asia, lack of a level playing field. Downstream customers face a highly concentrated, small monopolistic market. They look at price, performance, environmental footprint, and they have an interest to have a diversified supply chain that promotes competition. And the solution is really to bring people together, to have a risk sharing across value chains, diversified supply chains, collaborative R&D, joint public-private investments, and to raise public awareness. And if you look at this value chain, in the case of rare earth, it's actually not as by far not as big the investment needs as, for instance, if you look at batteries or semiconductor industries. Now, with this, the stakeholder consultation process, we're publishing an action plan, within the next 2 weeks, and we have developed 12 specific actions that relates to 4 key recommendations. And so this is creating a level playing field. We need to drive a commitment by EU OEMs to buy from EU rare earth industry, to make end-of-life products containing rare earth stay in Europe, so that we have, a feed for recycling to take place in Europe, and to provide CapEx support as much as possible following WTO rules. Of course, this is mainly focused on innovation and pushing innovation. Just to show you that only within the first few months, now focusing on rare earth and the rare earth supply chain, we have identified various projects that, if they were funded, they would substantially contribute to meeting the EU demand in rare earth magnets. So that's rare earth oxides, magnet alloy, and magnets, 20% of to 2030 demand. So it is possible, you can have a significant impact. And this is my final slide, just to emphasize, with all this talk about circular economy, of course, there is this need for mining. And this is just a scenario showing, if you consider a 10-year lifetime of an electric vehicle, by 2030, you would have those vehicles available that were launched and put to market by 2020. And this is the material you can have to, if you fully recycle them, to meet the demand by 2030. So it really shows recycling and circular economy is key, but we need also mining and sustainable and responsible sourcing. So I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. With this, I end my presentation, and I'm handing over to Ben, I think.
So I'll do a little bit of background here on myself and the firm. I'll talk about some of the areas that we're most excited about, the 3 Ds of modern energy infrastructure: decarbonization, decentralization, and democratization. I'll talk a little bit about innovation over the last few decades and exciting trends that we see going forward. And then I'll touch on a little bit of the role of policy and regulation and subsidies in some of these markets and industries. So just a little bit about myself. I've been at 40 North Ventures for about 1.5 years. Prior to that, spent 7 years at GE Ventures investing in industrial technologies. So I'm coming up almost on a decade of venture capital experience in the industrial sector. But prior to moving over to the venture side, I spent a number of years on the other side of the table at an early stage company as a mechanical engineer, developing compressor and expander technologies for various energy applications. So who's 40 North Ventures? So 40 North Ventures is a $200 million venture capital firm focused on industrial technology innovation at the earliest stages. So we invest in companies that are Series A and later. And so we're looking at teams and technologies that are coming out of a university lab or have very early commercial traction. Most of the technology risk has been retired, but they're really focused on scaling within a given market and focused on execution. So we invest across manufacturing, transportation, built environment, energy, food and agriculture as sort of industrial verticals that we focus on. But then thematically, we also look at what we call enabling technologies, which could be hardware or software innovations that span multiple industry verticals. So some of those include robotics, sensors, connectivity, machine learning, artificial intelligence. And then the other thing that I'll spend a little bit of time on, is business model innovation. So the landscape is changing quite dramatically. And as a result of that, we're seeing a lot of new business models in the energy sectors that are pretty interesting, and they're often enabled by the technology innovation that's going on. This is just a snapshot of our portfolio. We're about 2 years old as a venture firm. We've invested in 20 companies, and I should also touch on the relationship above the organization, which is our limited partner is 40 North Management, which is a family office headquartered in New York. It's a quite large family office, and it gives us a flexible pool of capital beyond the $200 million that we're investing in Series A and later companies, which becomes really important as these companies mature and go from proving out product market fit to how do we scale the business? How do we stand up manufacturing facilities? We need a whole lot more capital to really scale a business in the energy sector. And that flexible pool of capital that sits behind our venture fund is very useful for some of those, and we've leveraged it for a few of these companies. So I'll touch on the 3Ds here, and I don't think I'll be breaking any ground that folks aren't familiar with in some of these slides, but I'll explain why I think it's a really exciting convergence of a few key trends here. This is the LCOE chart. Everybody has seen it. Decarbonization has been going on for a very long time. We're at the point now where renewable energy sources are just cost competitive, and in many cases, just truly much more affordable, which is great. And it's been the focus for a long time. But you know, what we've come to realize, and I think lots of people are starting to realize, is that it's also a better product. Decarbonization is cleaner. We all love that. It provides energy independence, you know, geopolitically, but also just individually. If you put solar on your roof or you have a battery in your garage, you've now become somewhat energy independent in the you know, increasing cases of blackouts or power outages. It's also a simpler product. Maintenance is much easier. There's no moving parts in a PV panel. So how that's managed and the life expectancy and the ability to put it on your roof and sort of set it and forget it is a product improvement as much as an energy savings. And the last thing is the fact that customers that are purchasing energy through renewable sources have the ability to forecast their energy costs. This is why you see lots of large corporates moving towards PPAs. Obviously, there's a sustainability component of it, but to be to no longer be beholden to, you know, commodity fuel pricing and being able to project your energy costs for 10 years is a really powerful tool when you're running a business that's not in the business of just consuming energy. You're producing products, you're providing services, and it becomes a really important lever. The next trend is decentralization. So we saw decarbonization at the largest scale, you know, large utility scale solar projects replacing fossil fuel generated electricity. But now we're seeing it on rooftops. We've seen that trend for a long time, and I think we're at a massive inflection point. We're seeing it with energy storage products that have the ability to take a utility grid that was more of a cascading waterfall and create a dynamic network of energy assets that provides a massive amount of flexibility and resiliency at a reduced cost from a capital standpoint. That decentralization creates challenges as well as opportunities. And so we're seeing a lot of activity in demand response systems, energy management, both at sort of the residential and commercial footprint level, but also at the grid scale. You know, as you think about the California duck curve, for example, and you add a bunch of EVs, most people are driving their EVs during the day. They come home, they plug in, it's super convenient. It just turns out that they're plugging in at pretty much the worst point of the duck curve as they arrive home at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. So you need a layer of intelligence to manage that dynamic. Electric vehicles can be incredibly powerful tools for grid management if they're managed intelligently. And that holds true for energy assets across the board. The last piece that we're really excited about is the democratization. So I mentioned you've now got a grid that used to be a cascading waterfall to a much more dynamic grid. I could have a neighbor down the street from me that has solar on their roof. You know, the ability to share that electricity and that energy in an intelligent manner can be a very powerful tool. The decentralization of energy generation and energy storage enables communities that were remote or off the grid to now sort of seamlessly achieve a level of energy and electricity that you know, everybody should be entitled to have. And the technology is finally there, and the business models have created opportunities to deploy these solutions and these technologies in places that have been dark for a long time. So those are the technology trends and themes that we're seeing in the energy space. I did want to touch on just sort of different pools of capital and the role specifically of government subsidies. This chart you know, shows sort of the history of where the subsidies have shown up, and they can be very beneficial, and they're beneficial for one main reason, which is you know, the business of energy is a really low margin business, and it's an incredibly massive market opportunity, but the low margins make it difficult for early entrants to be competitive and to compete at an LCOE that you need to achieve requires a massive amount of scale, and to get there requires a lot of capital. But government subsidies can serve a very important purpose of bridging the gap between a company that's developing technology at a small scale and can provide a customer with a value proposition that makes sense, and the company can start to build scale, and eventually the government subsidies no longer become critical to the unit economics of that product. I think we've seen, you know, and I'll get to a slide in a minute here, but we've seen in the past a lot of dollars go into this space without that next frontier of capital being available. And there were a lot of good technologies and companies that failed as a result of that. And I think we've been smarter as early stage investors collectively, and as government administrations, to really understand what it takes to scale this technology, clean technology in the energy sector. So, you know, we've got a lot of activity right now in terms of subsidies and infrastructure bills, and the opportunity is massive, and I think we'll see even more activity as a result of that. What we're also seeing from the sort of bridging the gap standpoint is we're seeing large corporates and customers willing to sign up for future deliveries of products that can provide early stage investors some level of security that you know, it's no longer if you build it, they will come. They've already come, you have to build it to deliver it to them in some cases. And that can provide a level of security, again, for early stage investors looking at technology innovation in this space. So this is a quick chart to show some of the history in venture capital specifically, and where the dollars have gone on a historical basis. Obviously, we had a massive wave of investment, you know, in the late aughts and early tens that had various levels of success. What excites me about this chart the most, though, is, you know, if you look at the last 3 to 4 years, the amount of investment is increasing. The deal count, you know, the number of companies that this investment is showing up in is actually decreasing quite dramatically. This suggests that, you know, we've actually found a number of really great companies to invest more in and scale more rapidly. So we're seeing bigger bets from more investors in this space, and fewer sort of early stage science bets, but really the type of big $100 million transactions, $1 billion investments that are not just driving technology innovation, but truly driving business scale and impact. As venture capital investors in this space, we think that to be truly impactful, you have to be a successful business, which means you have to be a profitable business and attract investor dollars and have a compelling customer value proposition. And if you can check those boxes, then we believe that will be the most impactful solution. So in the business of venture capital, we're always thinking about what's next. As I see the future, I think a lot of the hard technology legwork has been done, and we are going to see acceleration like we have been unable to predict. If you look at these charts on the right, capacity additions, car sales, sort of productivity on an energy per unit of productivity, they're all improving much faster than we expected, and nobody's been able to predict that accurately, which has been great, been overachieving. So I think what this means for us as we're investing in early stage companies, these are going to create challenges. It's great that we will have 4x capacity additions in the next decade. We're looking at technology companies that are thinking about how do you design those projects? How do you finance those projects? What are innovative business models that could accelerate that even faster? What are the challenges going to be to the grid as a result of renewable, volatile energy generation and unpredictable electric vehicles plugging in all over the grid? Those are going to create massive opportunities, but also challenges. And we're looking at companies that are innovating in those spaces. And then on the last chart here, energy intensity, we are broadly an industrial firm, and we look at industrial broadly. So we're looking at manufacturing and supply chain type of verticals that are not straight down the fairway of energy, but they have an indirect impact to how goods are manufactured and transported, and that obviously has indirect implications on energy and sustainability. And the last slide here, I'll be brief today, is just some of the bets that we've made in the energy space at 40 North Ventures. These are companies that are more specifically focused on energy, and they span all the areas that I've discussed today: demand response, distributed generation, power electronics, and how energy is used in devices, electrification of transportation, and energy storage. Are some of the big themes that we're spending time on and bets we've made in the portfolio. So with that, I will pass the ball to Rick.
Thanks, Ben. Appreciate that. Really good stuff. Hi, everyone. I'm Rick Sains. I'm a partner at Pollination. I don't have slides, but I thought I'd just chat with you about the issues, bringing this a little bit back to the supply chain for the kinds of exciting growth that Ben was just articulating. Before I do that, let me give you a quick intro as to who Pollination is. So Pollination is a climate change advisory and investment firm. It was formed late 2019. There was about 12 of us at the time. We now have over 80 folks. We're in Chicago, DC, London, and a few places in Australia, with some folks basically through COVID being remote, but will ultimately consolidate in our UK London office. And we are solely focused on the economic transition to net zero emissions. We represent a range of clients, governments, large multinational companies in the resource sector, in the retail sector, in the tech sectors, and so have visibility really across the supply chain for the economic transition to low carbon and net zero. My personal background, I'm trained as a lawyer. I used to head the climate change practice for Baker McKenzie in North America for 19 years prior to starting up pollination with some other colleagues and partners. So what I like to chat about is going back to the question of critical raw materials and the role of thinking through how to scale this economic transition and the vital input that they play in this economic transition. And if you just go back to Ben's point, 18 times growth in electric vehicles by 2030, now that's going to be possible through dramatically expanded exploitation of the components that go into that, and critical to that are the batteries. And I think it was Jonas who had really good slides on where are these critical raw materials in the world and where is the processing capability that exists today. So thinking about how do we manage this, and I think it comes down to some trends and some fundamentals. The first of which is transparency. The second of which is accountability, and the third is governance. And those are related. And if we go back and think through the arc of supply chain governance, it usually starts with efforts to increase the transparency of what's happening in the supply chain generally. And once you have a means by which to have greater visibility as to what's happening in the supply chain, it leads, of course, to an understanding of the implications of the supply chain. And that can be everything from greenhouse gas emissions. So we talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Well, there was a time before those concepts were really even well known or even considered. I keep getting this buzz here, this pinging. I don't know what that is, but anyway. So it started as a voluntary corporate accounting standard for greenhouse gas emissions, and it ultimately embedded itself into regulation. And corporate standards, hard regulation. And it starts with transparency, leads to accountability, and ultimately winds up in legal liability or responsibility. And these are the trends that we're really seeing dramatically being advanced, and in part starting with the transparency piece. We advise and work with some companies that are doing some quite remarkable things, utilizing, similar to Ben's presentation, digitization, leveraging blockchain, but really thinking through getting traceability and measurability of specific environmental attributes at various points in the supply chain. So if you think about, for example, and this is slightly different than critical raw materials, but it's applicable and it's just an extension of this trend. In the fuels context, being able to go to the production well at the fuel site and actually have data on the various attributes of well A versus well B. And that now exists. And then you can create immutable attributes or digital twin attributes that can be traced throughout the supply chain. And why does that matter? And why is that important? Because with the increasing scrutiny and demand for ESG reporting that is being driven, a lot by large institutional investors, but also is being picked up by governments in the EU, as we've heard from the prior presentation. The accountability for managing the broader supply chain is really expanding in terms of the governance. And as is the ability to gather information on attributes, whether it be human rights issues, access to water, resource, we talked about responsible sourcing in the prior presentation. What does that mean? What are the standards for that? What are the metrics, and who is going to be held accountable for ensuring that the full supply chain in this transition towards climate compatible economies is actually done in a way that is consistent with the virtues of the clean revolution. And there folks have seen some of the recent articles about cobalt and some of the current challenges. And part of the challenge is that where some of the critical raw materials are in the world are in places where there isn't, at least historically and currently, the most robust governance frameworks. And so where does the responsibility fall on ensuring that as we dramatically expand the utilization of critical raw materials around the world for all the right reasons, right, in terms of shifting our energy complex towards low carbon and smart clean tech solutions, that we are addressing the entirety of the supply chain in that context. And just as an analogy, just a sense of like the impacts of the supply chain in terms of climate, some of in the resource sector, and this isn't really the critical raw material piece, but it's illustrative. If you just look at the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions of some of the large resource companies, they're actually doing a pretty good job in managing those, and they're exploring net zero aluminum, or our European friends would say aluminium production, and again green hydrogen. Some of these things are really exciting, but if you compare that to the scope 3 emissions of their products that are exported to China, this goes back to our conversation about decoupling, the climate impacts of the exported materials that are used in China for steel production and other things are exponentially greater than their scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And so, thinking about the climate consequences of the supply chain and trying to ensure that we, as a global system, do everything we can to encourage greater utilization of clean tech, which requires greater manufacturing capacity, lowered cost, greater deployment, while at the same time ensuring that the system as a whole, so that we're not only focusing on the endpoint of consumption in the supply chain, but we're actually tracing and tracking all of the critical environmental attributes. And I would add in, which is the continuing evolution, I would add in human rights, and other biodiversity, and all of the other elements that go into what will comprise the required reportable metrics. We need to ensure that we're doing this in a way that brings up the system as a whole. So I think it was our first presenter who talked about decoupling versus conscious collaboration. And there is no way of solving climate without having China be a force of change and be a meaningful, real part of the solution. And as they, are grappling with their own economic transformation, let's not forget that the whole movement towards globalization and outsourcing, which is a multi-decadal trend, was done for the purposes of lowering cost of goods sold and essentially outsourcing the manufacturer with understanding and knowledge that the standards and the sort of cost of doing it for various reasons were lower, and the whole economic system has benefited over many decades now from that that decision, that series of decisions, that collective acceptance of globalization. And the challenge, of course, is that there's some very important, meaningful externalities that have not been accounted for properly, and that is changing. That is changing, and so with greater transparency comes greater accountability, and accountability, drives governance, and ultimately hard regulation. And so I'll stop and end with the point that from a supply chain perspective, from an ESG reporting perspective, from a accountability perspective for multinational enterprises who are exposed to these supply chains, it is clear that the trend is moving from soft to hard accountability and legal liability and responsibility for reporting and addressing issues. And that trend, I think, is only going to continue. So I don't know where that leads the decoupling conversation. It's probably, relates to it in some ways, but fundamentally, I think we are so far down the interconnected globalized supply chain track that very hard to kind of reinvent that at this stage. So, I think that that this going back to the original point about conscious collaboration and really working to improve the systems from the entirety of the supply chain, where that is located, including in China, is really critical if we have a shot. And I would say staying at 1.5, I mean, we're, speeding past the ability to do that as we speak, but that's still something that should be strived for, a 1.5 degree limit on global warming. So let me stop there, and I look forward to the conversation afterwards. And I think I'm passing it over to Johan.
Thanks, Rick. That was really interesting, and I will not go into any details about the scope 2 and 3 of emissions, but it's sort of a bit touches on the things I will talk about. Let me just try to share the screen. Yeah, so I will talk about decarbonization of industrial processes and carbon pricing and industry response. And I should just mention initially that I'm working as a consultant for a UN Climate Change Convention program that is supporting the ASEAN countries, that is the Alliance of the Southeast Asian countries. So whatever I say here is my personal views, but of course I will draw on the experience from this work and a lot of other previous work, of course. I'm going to talk briefly about carbon pricing, which is sort of emerging as a key response for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I will bring up the border carbon adjustment, which is a sort of a new carbon pricing instrument. I will very briefly show how carbon intensive industries respond to carbon pricing, but that they also respond to long-term decarbonization targets like net zero 2050 targets, etc. And I know this conference is a lot about the risk of deficit of different minerals, but looking at the developments here, I think there's also a risk that we're facing electricity shortage locally, globally, regionally. Well, we'll see about that. But first, just to mention a little bit about carbon pricing. This is something that is emerging on a global scale. And as you see on this map, a lot of countries, particularly developed countries, but also upper middle income countries in Asia and in Latin America are adopting carbon pricing policies. That quite a large share of the globe is covered by the carbon pricing does, however, not mean that there's a lot of high prices that really guide investment decisions. So that's still a way to go. When we talk about carbon pricing, we talk mainly about two things. We talk about carbon tax, which sort of makes the polluters pay for whatever they emit. Carbon taxes, they provide certainty over the price of emissions. But as a regulator, you would not know what the quantity of emissions abated. Carbon trading, emissions trading, or cap and trade is the other main sort of carbon pricing instrument, and that involves the commoditization of carbon as allowances, and these can be traded, and the central authority, usually government, sets a cap. Polluters have to have as many permits in their accounts as or surrender as many allowances as they have emissions, and they can then trade to be in compliance. The difference between carbon tax is that this would provide some certainty over the quantity of emissions abated, but there's no certainty of what the price of emissions that is coming. There's also other types of carbon pricing, offset mechanism, baseline and crediting mechanisms, and you can also have internal or shadow carbon pricing. But these are sort of the main two types for governments to work with. Roland mentioned the ambitious EU plans, and a key part of the EU plans is, of course, the EU emissions trading scheme, which covers the power sector and manufacturing industry, etc. It's been ongoing since 2005. I'm going to bring up two examples from the industry, and that is the cement and steel sectors, and both these are, of course, covered by the EU emissions trading scheme. For these sectors, the abatement is costly. It's costly to make very deep reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. Normally, you can push this to consumers, but also in this case, these sectors are subject to international competitions, so they have enjoyed free allocation of allowances. So they don't have to buy it from the government, they have received allowances for free. There's a bit of a scaling in this, that some, depending on the risk of carbon leakage, that is that the industry moves somewhere else in the world, you have different levels of free allocation. Now, what is new in the EU, and something that will come as the proposal for Fit 55, which I think Roland also mentioned, is that there is a proposal for border carbon adjustment. And I will briefly introduce you to that. Border carbon adjustments the purpose is to reduce the risk of carbon leakage. And that is when a country implements ambitious climate policy, there is a risk that the industry simply will move to another part of the world. I think you're familiar with that. And of course, you can design a border carbon adjustment mechanism in different ways. What is important here, and which also seems to be part of the proposal from the European Commission that is coming, is that if you're producing in the country that also have ambitious climate policy or carbon pricing, okay, then you can have then you will be credited for that, so you can pay less of a border adjustment fee. So that's a key point. This conference is about trading and competition and so on, and of course a key question here is this something that's going to work? The thing that, okay, we're not only pricing our own emissions, we're also pricing your emissions. Is that going to work? Well, that's something that we will see. Certainly it can heighten trade tensions. I'm sure there's going to be discussions related to the World Trade Organization, etc. And for instance, the International Monetary Fund argues that border carbon adjustments is the second best solutions. And they say that, okay, it would be better if we have an international carbon price floor for large emitters. But as we all know, to negotiate such floor prices among China, EU, India, and US, etc., that's not going to be easy. So we may be stuck with the second best solution. In any case, this EU CBAM, as it's called, this illustrates this point that, okay, we cannot get the global price on carbon. We're not going to have carbon pricing taxes or carbon taxes all over the world simultaneously. We're not going to have a global carbon tax. So what do? Yeah, we say we tax our own emissions, but we will also tax your emissions. Just very briefly to give you a couple of examples before I come back to what this CBAM could mean for a region like Southeast Asia. And this is just to illustrate that you have sectors, you have companies, you have facilities that they are in compliance with the EU ETS. There's no problem. They pay for the allowances they need, etc. But what we see is also actions to come further and to actually become fossil-free in the long run. And there's one example from my own country is called hybrid, and it's based on making iron and steel production fossil-free using electricity and hydrogen. When we will have steel that is fossil-free is another question. This is going to take quite a lot of time. It's still in the research and development phase with heavy government support, but the signal is sort of there. Industries are planning to be trying to become fossil-free in the longer term. The same is for cement, and it's also they have a similar dilemma as the steel industry. Very difficult to reduce emissions significantly. The key strategy they would have is to use carbon capture and storage. But that is also something that is still costly and difficult to do. But the key point here, again, is that cement industry, is in compliance with the EU ETS, having the right amount of allowances, paying the price necessary, etc. But they're preparing to become fossil-free as well. And just looking a little bit on about what border carbon adjustment can mean in terms of trade. There's a study by the International Energy Agency, and they have looked particularly at Thailand, India, and Vietnam. And the assumption is, of course, that cement, steel, aluminum, and other industrial sectors will be a key part of this EU CBAM. And as you see on the slide, there's annually quite a lot of numbers, sort of high numbers that would be the bill at the border of the EU. And depending on the sector, it's a significant share of the current prices. At the same time, they conclude that the impacts on the national GDP for the countries is not going to be severe. So it's really something that simply impacts these sectors. Interesting here is also then that if Thailand or India and Vietnam would have carbon pricing in their own countries, they could have their bill reduced. And of course, one of the questions is when and if and how could that be feasible? Well, obviously, this report from IEA does not come from anywhere. It comes from that there's a current concern about this EU CCAM or BCAM. Yeah, you can use any abbreviation you want there. And of course, what you see in Southeast Asia is an emerging carbon pricing schemes. Did the EU BCAM speed this up? Probably not, because it's quite new. Will it speed it up? Yeah, maybe. So what we see is we have already a carbon tax in Singapore. We have voluntary emissions trading in the power sector in Indonesia. It's a pilot system. We have voluntary pilot schemes in Thailand. In other countries in the region, there's legislation that facilitates or prepares for carbon pricing instruments in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Brunei Darussalam, etc. But the question here is, of course, that there's not the question, sorry, the challenge here, of course, is that it's quite a long way to go before these countries have any kind of price on carbon that would give an impact on the bill that they would have to pay under EU border carbon adjustment mechanism. And they, of course, face other problems: poor industrial policy, complex renewable energy policy architecture, regulated power sectors. It's difficult to implement carbon pricing when you have that kind of situations. So what will the effect of EU CBAM have? Well, it can lead to the development of carbon market clubs, that you sort of encourage these countries to link up with the EU emissions trading scheme. Not tomorrow, it's quite a way in the future, but still. Will there be a drive within the ASEAN as a region to develop their own carbon pricing scheme or emissions trading scheme, so they would have sort of the counterpart against the EU ETS? Will there be discussion on carbon price floors among the trading partners? So this is something that we will see, and I think may come up as part of these discussions. I see I have 7 seconds left, so I will be very brief. Key here, decarbonization of industrial sectors, high costs, high risks, but EU can work and build on regional collaboration. I think Roland presented this very well as well. The decarbonization in EU, they will have support from the BCAM policy, but how effective would that be? And just a final point, when we look at these sectors, there's going to be a high demand for electricity. Fossil-free industrial production that rely on electricity requires fossil-free electricity generation. And this is going to be challenged also in a country like Sweden, if you foresee fossil fuel-free steel production. And the situation in middle-income developing countries is going to probably even be worse. Consider you have to add the electrification of the transport sector, the demand for cooling, etc. So I will just stop there by noting that the major policy shifts are needed. A lot of things are happening, a lot of good things, but I hope and I think there will be major policy shifts ahead, not only in the EU, but in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Johan. I'd like to invite everybody back to turn on their cameras and their microphones. I mean, this was a really, I think, a really interesting, almost scintillating conversation, because it touches upon so many different issues. First of all, I'll start with the conscious collaboration. I think you're onto something in terms of the terminology, but China is here to stay. China is part of the solution. And I just want to throw it out here because in terms of investment, I see that we've been talking a lot about investment in companies that I'm assuming are US based. We see Europe making these huge efforts to do both, to stay interdependent, but also build resiliency. But I think that Roland also brought out these ideas of the circular economy that we don't hear enough of. The transparency of the supply chains is going to be very revealing. What Rick was saying, I mean, part of the critique of China has also had to do with the supply chains. What will happen when we know that we're all in this together, and that, you know, it's not only China that might be having supply chains that are not as, how would I say it? I don't want to say transparent, but that they're not as we would have envisioned them to be. These supply chains, again, are global. Everybody's pretty much, buying from the same network in different combinations. So let's talk, and one other thing that came up, and we have some questions also from participants, but we talk about net zero, but we also talked about climate neutrality, and these are two different things. So I don't know where to begin, but I would like to just throw it out there and talk about, let me ask Ben about, the investments that you're looking on. They're very US centric. Have you been looking outside of the US?
Yeah, we invest outside of the US. I think the part of our focus on North America is just our physical presence in North America. We're investing in companies that are at a very early stage, and we're pretty hands-on with those investments. And we have an investment team that's largely US based. And so, it becomes a management problem more than sort of, geography problem. But we do have investments, that said, in Israel and Europe as well. There's a ton of innovation going on there, and there are a bunch of great investors in those ecosystems as well.
Do you factor in this question again? We're sort of in an OECD space. Is it because of the risk factors? I mean, one of the questions that we've been examining is also the role of the developing world. We've just heard, from Johan, how difficult it is. I mean, as the big players try to set in the targets, the standards, they're doing the innovation, they're using all of the muscular, all of their financial power to drive all of this change, which is overwhelming when I hear about all these different sectors. What about the developing world? Is it that nothing is happening there? Is it the risk is it just a question of your firm's interest? What would be the more general take on this? Do they have a role to play?
So I think yes. I think the developing world is, there are a number of challenges. You outlined them. There's also an interesting opportunity in that, the technology has in some ways leapfrogged the infrastructure that we have in the ground in the developed world, and we're trying to maybe fit a round peg in a square hole, or square peg round hole, where the developing world can sort of start from a blank sheet of paper. That's an opportunity, I think, but there are a massive number of challenges. I think that the biggest one for us as early stage investors is just the way that business is done in the developing world. You really need to understand those pockets and how business works there. And to do that, you have to be local, in our opinion. And we are not local. So, we don't consider ourselves the experts in those business models. I think the technology has created massive opportunities, and I think you're seeing lots of entrepreneurs that are focused on delivering those technologies through unique business models in the developed world. We have stayed away, not because we don't like the opportunity, but we don't think we're the right partners necessarily.
So I think that everybody in different capacities, and Rick, I think you were going to answer. There's a lot of paperwork, all this transparency, all of these investments. It seems as if there's going to be a lot of, I want to say, paperwork, regulatory, guidelines. There are going to be a lot of how would you say, new tasks for businesses who are trying to also not only invest, but deploy the new technologies. How is this, please, whoever wants to jump in, is this going to actually hinder the process? It seems like we need to be accelerating, but in Europe, they have stakeholder involvement. Sometimes I think businesses think, oh, really, do I need to talk to all the stakeholders? Who are all these stakeholders? Are they trying to slow down the process? I mean, if there's too many cooks in the kitchen, will we ever be able to do this in like the 2-3 decades that we have in front of us? This is a massive overhaul. I mean, each day that we've been, looking into different aspects of the transitions, both for decarbonization and digitalization, I think we discovered that it's a massive task that requires very centralized planning in the end, or at least government guidelines. And while Europe seems to have a plan that we can all kind of present in a way that on slides that makes sense, China has a plan that you can sort of present on slides. The United States has basic ideas, and it doesn't seem as if we could, have a blueprint or roadmap ahead. So how will all of this affect, Rick?
Yeah, I mean, let me just come back to that question. Before I lose my other thought, I was going to just add something to what Ben was saying, which is that, from the investing side of the house, one of the things that we are spending a lot of time with private equity houses and banks is looking at the embedded risk in portfolios of either lending assets or portfolio companies. And part of that embedded risk and opportunity, by the way, is positioning the portfolio companies for market growth, but also trying to dig into what are they exposed to by way of physical and transition climate risk. And in the context of the transition risk, which is the policy undertakings, this whole idea of the expanded culpability, responsibility for supply chains and scope 3, if you have big exposure to critical raw materials, as part of your business, we need to start analyzing what does that look like over the next 5 years or the next 10 years. If you're in a fund scenario and you're investing and you're looking at what are the exit strategies for some of these companies, what is the landscape going to look like, and how do you position the companies to be top tier performing companies, and can you create additional value in the portfolio by having some more sophisticated screening on the various types of risk. And we just see supply chain as an inherent part of that analysis. I just wanted to make that point. So there is, even if you're not investing in companies that are located in, emerging markets, if their supply chain is totally dependent upon these markets, that can affect, an assessment of the underlying risk for the companies. In respect of the other question, just really quickly, in respect of the question you asked, it's interesting, right? Because let's take the US, for example, the environmental laws, the National Environmental Policy Act has been used by environmental groups many, many times successfully and for good reason in challenging permitting for coal plants or new port infrastructure to allow coal to be exported to China, or different plans for mines, and then you think about leasing on federal lands for the fossil fuel industry. Well, it's the same type of questions have to be asked, and to what degree do we as a society accept some compromise when we're now talking about large scale wind, utility scale wind projects on federal lands, or large scale solar projects that might have some impact on localized environmental issues. And we do. I mean, democracy is slow, and that is one of the challenges that has plagued our ability to really catalyze, a real movement quickly, because you can hold things up in the process, and that is part of our governance. And so it's an interesting question as to whether we can get out of our own way to really scale this stuff up. It's not like an iPhone. I mean, that's the thing. The energy system is not an iPhone. It is technology related, but it's not a consumer good product that you can just sell at retail. It is a regulated market that fundamentally requires all kinds of multifaceted coordination with government, local, regional, national governments, and then the private market working together. And so unlocking some of these barriers to scale is really going to be key.
Roland, what about stakeholders in Europe? And I also want to, while I'm at this, and then I'm going to ask Jonas about this as well, but Julie Klinger had a question about As you know, she says, there are wildly varying cost estimates thrown around in relation to the US Green New Deal. Could you share more on efforts to quantify the public investment gap in Europe's GND, Green New Deal? How are people going about this? So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the stakeholder involvement. Is it a success story? Is it helping the process? And also, if we could answer Julie's question.
Yeah. So first of all, my response also, to the reflections before is a stakeholder consultation process, and then kind of democracy in general can be kind of slow. However, looking at the past, I mean, our competition-driven, market-driven way we do things has been actually quite effective. So many of these technologies that China is deploying it's been developed elsewhere, right? So you mentioned solar. We had a massive solar industry in Europe, particularly in Germany. And a key flipping point in the whole game was that not that we didn't export solar cells anymore, but actually the machines that produce solar photovoltaic cells, right? So there was a massive knowledge transfer. And then, in China, you would then just be able to produce it even cheaper because of the local conditions. So knowledge transfer there. Same with wind turbines, same with high-speed trains. So, Europe was the leader in high-speed trains. Today, they're not even asked anymore for an auction process. They're rolled over by a Chinese massive thing, right? So, and we're not even in Europe because of WTO conditions, not even allowed to have a merger between the two biggest train producers, which are tiny compared to those in China, because we stick to WTO rules and we have some competition laws. So, and I think we can have, because just this one point related, we can have technology or industry transfer back in other places. You can see this with the batteries happening. So I think it's not about decoupling, but rather diversification, not about replacing, but promoting competition. This is where we're really good at, right? Competition. And you cannot have competition if there's a lack of a level playing field. So, and you can describe it very detailed and have a good example, but this goes a bit too far now, for the very specific rare earth industry, where it's a specific tax and subsidy system that is almost kind of WTO compliant, but that you can be the most innovative company, but you will always lose out because of that lack of level playing field. Yeah. So it's, and to understand that mechanisms, you need to have a stakeholder consultation process, right? You need to have industry telling you this is the real issue we face, and no Brussels bureaucrat or wouldn't ever understand that. So you need to have the stakeholder consultation process. And the challenge is it can be long, particularly in COVID times. It can be very slow, but still so you need to consult people, but then wrap it up, bring it together, and make a decision and move forward. So I would consider this to be a success story. And about the overall costs, so so there are these public numbers. They estimate this transition Green Deal to be 1.8 trillion euros, right? So a massive amounts of money. And the emission trading system should fund a lot of this, but we have a recovery fund in place now with 750 billion, I think. And out of that, I think it's 500 billion grants, right? So, or not grants, but public money. So yeah, so that's the less is then loans and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, but I'm not in detail. So that's kind of rough estimates. So it's certainly a big investment. Let's put it this way, and hopefully it pays out. Yeah.
Jonas, I mean, I think we heard this from everybody. I mean, we can't ignore China. China is part of the solution. With all the challenges, with all of the politics, why is that so hard to conceive? Is the whole American plan, in fact, going to, sometimes I say the US will be unwittingly helping to stall the whole decarbonization process. Because if we're so busy, being stuck in this fraught geopolitical mindset and the decoupling mindset, how will we be able to come to these kinds of, let's say, negotiations and solutions for a transparent taxonomy? All I heard about recently is about how we can't even do the investments unless we have taxonomy that makes sense across banking systems and borders and, the financial sector. How is there no understanding in Washington and that there is a more nuanced approach? And also, how are the Chinese, owning up to the fact that there has to be more transparency, that they have to level the playing field more?
Wow, that's a complicated question. I mean, I think essentially, sort of, if I look at this at a high level, a lot of it has to do with institutions that existed before we cared about these industries, right? And so China had developed this banking system and incentives for local bureaucrats to essentially broker loans for manufacturing enterprises. And we focused very much on what the interest rate was of these loans, but the real innovation was that these firms were able to get loans at all when no one in the world was willing to lend to these young industries that were unproven, and it was unclear if they would ever reach cost parity with fossil fuels, right? And so China had that institution kind of going into this new age. The US had a set of institutions that are really focused on spinning off startups from federally funded research projects at universities. And since, the Second World War, we have sort of lived with this philosophy that if you pour the money in at the top of the funnel, it'll trickle its way through and we will end up getting an industry at the end of this. And globalization has really upended these assumptions in some ways, right? Because we can now throw the money in and it'll end up in China. And that's why everyone here is upset. And the Europeans have their vocational training systems and they can be nimble and have these small companies that can get in there and make manufacturing equipment and so on. So everyone's unhappy because they all want the entire industry at home and everyone's just getting a little slice. So the Chinese are unhappy. Made in China 2025 was about making more at home and becoming more independent. The Americans are unhappy, not really doing anything about it concretely. And the Europeans are also unhappy and are sort of starting to get into business. And so I've collected over the last year data on the stimulus packages and the recovery and how much money was spent on emissions reducing and emissions increasing activities. I can share this figure briefly if it's of interest, but you basically see at the bottom here, the breakdown in stimulus spending, and it's really only the European Union, Korea, and Germany that have made some attempt to use this money to invest in these industrial policy projects, right? And so the battery money that Roland was talking about has come out in part of that effort. The overall sum of stimulus spending gets smaller and smaller as you go to the right. So like it's a little misleading because, Argentina, Brazil looks like they've done a lot, but it's, out of a very minuscule operation. And so I think what that shows to me is that we've understood the problem. People are unhappy and discontent, but they're also not really doing what they need to do in order to change the balance here. And so that's, I think, the key challenge. We'll have to figure out a system for funding large-scale manufacturing in the United States if that's what we want to do. And going back, 10, 15 years ago when I was a grad student at MIT, there was all this modeling about why Chinese solar panels were so cheap, and a lot of it was just scale economies. And so unless we get to these kinds of scale economies, we're not going to be competitive, but that means investing billions and billions of dollars into manufacturing plants, and that's probably exceeding what Ben can do for us at that scale and also at that sort of part in the deployment curve. And so I think that's sort of the core issue here, right? So some rebalancing, I think, would be good. Some diversification would be good. We also don't want to have all of this dependent on one country that then shuts the borders and we're all sort of, stranded. And we've seen this with, Fukushima and the auto sector and sort of everything breaking down because so much of it was concentrated in Japan. So there are lots of reasons to do this, but it's going to be a gradual process and one that requires real cash. And so far, people are reluctant to put up that cash. And I don't think it's going to come from the private sector necessarily. I think it'll require some sort of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac for the clean energy transition. So that's sort of where I see the tension in the current thing. We all want full industries at home, but we're institutionally really set up to only support a part of that industry and not the entire thing. And then maybe my last point would be that there's also a lot of hot talk in this decoupling debate. So with a few colleagues, we were just working on a World Bank paper that should be coming out soon, going through clean energy policies over the last 10 years, sort of since the last recession, and how much of it is actual decoupling that is pushing countries, pushing manufacturing to relocate back from China, like sort of targeted attempts to move supply chains around, and how much of it is just industrial policy that's trying to increase the domestic competitiveness. There's very, very little money spent on the actual decoupling. A lot of it is green industrial policy that's really about shoring up domestic competitiveness. And so that's, I think, encouraging, because it means, let's focus on being, if you want to win the race, try to run faster. Don't blame the other one for having got nice shoes. And so I think we've been doing the shoe game a lot, and I think we're shifting maybe to doing a little bit of training and actually getting on the course in order to run faster. But I think all of it is not at the scale at which we need it if we want to be proud of where we got to in 2030 in terms of emissions.
So Ben, I mean, is the US government spending enough money that impacts your decisions? I mean, do you feel as if, as I said, there's a lot of discussion, the infrastructure plan, the stimulus plan, there's so much money going out there, God forbid we, look at the tax bills. But is the money really going in this kind of a productive a direction that's going to help us both really create added value to the US economy into the future, and also green it so that it can be climate resilient and we can reduce the emissions?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably no. I think Jonas is right. And I think the type of capital that Jonas is talking about is different than subsidies that's effectively the government putting the finger on the scale of which technologies could potentially win. From our standpoint, subsidies, we don't like to underwrite investments based on subsidies because they can disappear and can be challenging in that respect. I think something like an infrastructure bill that enables businesses and customers in the US to deploy infrastructure, to buy the right technologies, right? And right is a general word here, but to buy the best technologies, I think that doesn't exist today. I think there can be much more of that, and maybe we'll see it. But I think that's what Jonas is talking about, is the type of capital that can really scale industries, not necessarily tip the scales for early stage technologies. I think in some cases, some of the technology subsidies have been there, right? Certainly on the renewables side, that was massive tailwind for renewables for a given period of time. But manufacturing, there's a bunch of industries where just there's more scale needed for sure.
So Konstantin Karyanopoulos has a question for Roland. What are the specific lessons you've learned from the Battery Alliance that you're looking to apply to IRMA?
Yeah, so I think what was really new was really this value chain approach. So looking up, the last years, you could really see that, for instance, talking raw materials to raw materials people won't get you very far. So you need to talk raw materials to those that use, and raw materials that need to have access to advanced materials. So in the case of the batteries, from the very beginning, you had this involvement of the OEMs and tier one suppliers. And interestingly, I was really involved in these early stage discussions, and in the beginning was really not clear how much money you can make from the actual cell manufacturing. Battery value chain, you have battery materials, you make a battery cell, then you create battery modules, and then you have the battery, and then you integrate them in the electric vehicle. And of course, you want to stay as much on the highest value add creation level as possible to make most of the money. And it was always not clear how much can you really, how do we deal with this cell manufacturing component? And several people were not sure about it. Volkswagen, didn't know if they should invest. And then they basically, at some stage, they made a decision. Yes, we will source our battery cells from CATL, Chinese manufacturer, from Samsung, from the Koreans. However, we will also invest €1 billion, and now it's 1.5 billion euros in our own European joint venture in battery cell manufacturing with Northvolt. Yeah, so this dialogue with OEMs from the very beginning and involving them as much as possible. This is what we learn here. Awareness raising, so everybody talks about batteries these days in Europe, and to identify as early as possible, the good entrepreneurs and investors in the business. So in the case of batteries, you have Northvolt, two experienced Tesla managers that that came back to Europe, say we want to install our own business on batteries. So in this combination, and of course to collaborate closely with the Commission and member states to invest into new and create new regulation that is promoting it. So the whole case.
Thank you. There are two more questions I want to touch upon because we're going to be wrapping up in the next 10 minutes. One is from Rashrab Bandari. The advancement in things like grid modernization, innovation, and even transition to net zero seems to be accelerating in the advanced economies. What can emerging and other economics learn from the experience so far, considering carbon neutrality pledges by mid-century seem to be growing globally? Is there room for optimism to hit the 1.4 target? Any thoughts? Are we still optimistic?
I'm optimistic. I have to be optimistic. Otherwise, why would we be doing this? So I think whether it was Ben or Jonas, somebody mentioned leapfrogging, and the idea that the emerging markets don't have to follow the trajectory of the United States or even China or India. I mean, all of the other markets that are out there, the whole goal should be to scale and deploy the innovations that are out there now. And in many cases, if you don't have a massive transmission infrastructure already in place, and you want to electrify a bunch of rural areas, is it really the best idea to build a massive, central power plant and then build transmission lines out fired on coal? Is that really the economic way to do it? Or is it better to, you leverage microgrids and smaller installations that are enabled by the technologies that are being deployed with Ben's firms? So that's the promise, is that we can get there quicker and cheaper and better by deploying these, but we have to get them deployed. We have to get them out there, and they have to be, so what are the barriers to deployment globally? And scaling the deployment, I think, is really one of the things I'd like to make sure we don't lose sight of.
Yes, that's a very huge issue. And we talk a lot about leapfrogging, but Johan also pointed out that, we tell everybody to leapfrog, but meanwhile, they kind of have to consume. We're telling them to just buy the more advanced technologies that we're producing. That's the first thing. And the second thing is they're at a certain level of development where they're still stuck in past, let's say, practices that are more energy intensive and emission intensive practices. And Johan said, what are countries to do, like India and Vietnam, when the European Union has effectively decided that it wants to tax all of this carbon? Johan, would you like to jump in on this?
Yeah, I sort of agree with Rick that there are reasons to be optimistic. I think one of the things is that there's a lot of things done in the EU, in China, in US, and these countries, they don't have to do the same mistakes. the key is to pick up policies, regulations, strategies, but they need to make them their own and to apply that in a way that makes sense for their countries. Some of the barriers that I think is still there is that, I mean, for instance, you have one country that requires that if you put up a facility that is going to produce something, a major part of that facility has to be made or built by a large part of domestic manufactured equipment. And that of course, makes it difficult for them then to put down on the ground a plant with high level of let's say advanced technology, because they cannot import that technology. So there's, at the same time, that there's reason to be optimistic. There's leapfrogging. They can definitely look at how countries in the developed world have done things, and we have made mistakes too, so they can look at them as well. But from my point, I think there's a lot of work needed still, not only on the policy, but also, and I think a few of you have touched upon this, that you need to have this dialogue between the government and the industry, so that you learn from each other and understand where things are going. I'm not sure that answers your question, but I'll stop there.
I wanted to combine two sort of final questions, observation. One is to Jonas by Kristen Vicasi, who says, Jonas' comments about how forced technology transfer was not so common in the clean energy sector as compared to other sectors were so interesting. Why did it happen that way? And the last thing I wanted to say is, as we're talking about all this technology transfer and leapfrogging and the developing world and the race to, keep the climate from the temperature from rising, China again has the only game in town, that is a global development plan through the Belt and Road Initiative. And now the Biden administration has been saying, well, we need to also counter-propose another blueprint, which is building back better. What are the prospects? I mean, what about this a counter proposal? Again, why does it have to be a parallel or a competitive other framework to help the developing world? Jonas, and then anybody else who wants, and we'll wrap it up.
I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that wind and solar were sort of the first post-globalization industries, right? So this is not the auto sector where we had manufacturing and R&D in many parts of the world, and then China sort of entered the scene and was trying to pull from these other places. This was an industry that in many parts of the world were still sort of people screwing together wind turbines in their garage in the 1990s. So there wasn't an established division of labor yet. And so I think everyone kind of built on their institutional advantages and entered in these sectors in a different way, and then found each other to try to get the stuff to market. In the solar space in particular, a lot of the early technologies were kind of openly available. I mean, a lot of the Chinese firms were founded by folks who had done a PhD in Australia in one of the solar PV labs there, and then came back to China and got the same treatment as any other manufacturing startup to try to get these technologies out. So, there was a lot sort of technology floating around, and there were European design houses that were willing to license turbines for Chinese companies for a fee. So it wasn't as guarded and kind of closed of a system as, say, like the auto industry, where China made these joint venture requirements in order to get foreign companies to come in and train up the domestic firms. So I think it really was a sort of a reason of timing and maturity of these industries.
Thank you. Belt and Road, anybody? Belt and Road, building back better, leapfrogging through these systems. Anybody want to chime in?
I mean, I guess all I'd say is that this is one of the virtues that somebody was saying, competition, competition. If there can be a competition for winning the economic race of the 21st century, it's at least clear to me that that's going to be won through solving climate. So, Belt and Road is both an economic, it's a geopolitical, it's a very strategic policy. And there is an opportunity and a need really from a geopolitical standpoint, but also from an environmental standpoint to create some competition there. And if we can be better at, getting more clarity in the United States on our own politics and sort of, vision for what the US will be doing in the future. And that's not easy to do. That will help, but it's hard to compete when you can't even agree on what the facts are. So, I just hope we can compete because it would be good for the world.
On that note, anybody closing thoughts? I want to thank you all very, very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure, and I know that this has been very instructive. I'll follow up to let you know when it'll be on live on the Caltech YouTube channel. Thank you so much. Take care, and I hope to see participants in the next panel, which will focus on the socioeconomic and environmental implications of the decarbonization and digitalization of the global economy. Thank you again.